Your lecturer is Dr. Thad A. Polk. Dr. Polk is an Arthur F. Thurnau Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. He received an interdisciplinary PhD in computer science and psychology from Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Polk's research combines functional imaging of the human brain with computational modeling and behavioral methods to investigate the neural architecture underlying cognition. One of his major projects has investigated changes in neural representations as we age. Dr. Polk's teaching has been recognized by numerous awards at the University of Michigan, and he has been named to the Princeton Review's list of the best 300 professors in the United States.
Welcome to our course on the aging brain. If you're taking this course, then you presumably have some questions about what happens to our brains as we age. Do our brains inevitably deteriorate as we get older? Are we destined to lose our mental sharpness with age? And perhaps most importantly, are there any specific steps that we can take to help us age a little more gracefully? Well, this course will answer all of those questions and many more. We'll see that normal aging is indeed associated with some types of neural and cognitive decline, as well as with an increased risk for certain brain diseases. But we'll also see that for many people, age-related changes in the brain are actually fairly subtle, and they don't undermine their ability to lead stimulating and fulfilling lives. And many aspects of our mental life actually tend to remain stable or even improve with age. Furthermore, by adopting a few strategies that have been scientifically demonstrated to improve our brain health, we may be able to delay or even avoid many age-related impairments. So the negative stereotypes that view old age as a time of significant mental decline really don't capture what it's like for many people. The truth is that life's later years really can be the golden years. And I suspect that's particularly true for many of our older Great Courses customers. Well, let's dive in. Now, when scientists talk about aging, they usually don't mean a simple increase in chronological years. So imagine if you could take a drink from the fountain of youth and you suddenly became young again. Well, that wouldn't change your chronological age or wipe out all the intervening years. It would just eliminate the damaging effects of all those years. And it's those age-related effects that scientists are most interested in understanding. So when scientists refer to aging, what they usually mean is what's called senescence, or the accumulation of harmful effects that make us more fragile and vulnerable to disease and death as we get older. If a 20-year-old trips and falls, it's usually not a very big deal. Even if they twist an ankle or break a bone, they'll usually recover pretty quickly and be back on their feet in no time. But if an 80-year-old falls and breaks a hip, they typically have a much harder time recovering, and they may never recover at all. Now, this increase in vulnerability or senescence is typically estimated by modeling mortality as a function of chronological age. It turns out that after controlling for external causes like being hit by a car or killed in a war, the chance of dying doubles every 8 years after we reach adulthood. That is, a 58-year-old is twice as likely to die as a 50-year-old, and 4 times more likely to die than a 42-year-old. And this exponential increase in mortality rate is sometimes called the Gompertz law of mortality, after the British mathematician who first discovered the relationship back in the early 1800s. And that increasing vulnerability and deterioration is what scientists usually mean by aging. So, has aging, defined in this way, changed much over time? That is, are we aging more slowly or more gracefully today than our ancestors did? Well, based on claims in the media, you might think that the answer has to be yes. For example, you've probably heard people say that the population is graying, meaning that the number of older people has been growing dramatically. And it definitely has. In 1900, only about 4% of the US population was aged 65 or older, whereas today, over 13% of our population is. Likewise, only about 3 million Americans were aged 65 or older in 1900. Today, that number is over 40 million. The last 150 years have also seen a dramatic increase in life expectancy, or the number of years that a newborn baby can be expected to live on average. In 1850, life expectancy was less than 40 years. By 1930, it was around 60 years. And today, it's almost 80 years. So the average lifespan has roughly doubled in the past 150 years. But do these numbers really mean that we're aging more slowly than we used to? For example, was a 40-year-old in 1850 considered really old? Well, the answer is no. The truth is that there were plenty of 70 and 80-year-olds back in 1850. In fact, a 40-year-old in 1850 would be expected to live an average of about 30 more years. The main reason that life expectancy has increased is not because we age more slowly, but rather because we've gotten so much better at treating diseases that have nothing to do with age, particularly in infants and children. For example, believe it or not, infant mortality rates today are actually more than 25 times lower than they were in 1900. And obviously, if you eliminate a huge number of dying infants from the calculation, then it's going to increase life expectancy dramatically, even if the aging process itself hasn't changed. And the evidence suggests that it hasn't. For example, we pointed out that the probability of dying doubles every 8 years after we reach adulthood. That's called the mortality rate doubling time, and it really hasn't changed much over the last century. In fact, the original estimate was calculated in 1825, and it's remained very similar ever since. So, although there are a lot more older people around today than there were 100 years ago, and although life expectancy is dramatically higher, the process of aging itself hasn't changed very much at all. Okay, so now that we have a handle on what we mean by aging or senescence, let's turn to the brain. Does the brain age? That is, does the brain also experience senescence? Does it deteriorate and become more vulnerable to damage and disease as we get older? Unfortunately, the answer is definitely yes. For example, as you undoubtedly know, aging is associated with significantly higher risk for many brain diseases. In fact, age is the single greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, for Parkinson's disease, and for stroke. And we'll talk about all of those diseases later in the course. But aging is also associated with cognitive declines even in the absence of significant disease. However, it turns out that those declines are often restricted to a few specific cognitive processes. And for many people, even those declines are relatively subtle. Some of the best work on age-related changes in cognition has been done by my longtime collaborator, Denise Park, who used to be at the University of Michigan, but is now at the University of Texas at Dallas. Back around the year 2000, she and her research team recruited nearly 350 healthy people, ranging in age from 20 to 92, and gave them all a battery of cognitive tests, assessing everything from processing speed to different types of memory to vocabulary. And then they compared those abilities in each decade of life. And what they found was very interesting. Specifically, some aspects of cognitive function declined, but others didn't. In particular, they identified 3 specific areas of mental function in which aging seemed to have a detrimental effect: processing speed, executive function, and episodic memory. So let's spend some time talking about each. And first, consider processing speed. Participants in the study performed 3 different tasks that assessed processing speed. First, they performed what's called the digit symbol task. So they were given a sheet of paper that contained a kind of secret code. For each of the digits 1 to 9, the paper listed a corresponding geometric figure. For example, the number 1 might be associated with a circle, and 2 might be associated with a triangle. Then, they were given a sequence of numbers with blanks next to them, and asked to use that paper to fill in the blanks with as many of the corresponding figures as they could in 90 seconds. In another task, they were given pairs of letter strings, and they were asked to decide whether each pair of strings was identical or not, as fast as they could. And the scientists measured how many pairs the participants judged correctly in 30 seconds. And they did the same thing with pairs of very simple patterns or line drawings. And for all 3 tasks, they found the same results. 20-year-olds were the fastest, 30-year-olds were a little slower, 40-year-olds were slower still, and with each passing decade, processing speed declined a little bit more. In fact, it declined by a roughly constant amount every decade. And this decline actually started in the 20s. So the bottom line is that aging makes us a little slower. And not just physically, but also mentally. It's not that we can't perform the same mental calculations that we used to. It's just that it may take us a little bit longer than it once did. Dr. Park's team also found that aging affected what's often called executive function. Executive function refers to our ability to oversee and manage our more basic cognitive processes. Think of what an executive does at a company. That person wouldn't typically sort the mail or pay the bills or design the advertising. Rather, the executive might set goals to be accomplished, delegate responsibilities to specific teams of employees, allocate resources, and monitor progress. Well, likewise, the executive functions of the brain are not basic cognitive functions like recognizing a face or moving your arm or avoiding obstacles when you walk. Rather, we're talking about setting goals, delegating processing responsibilities to other specialized cognitive processes, deciding what to pay attention to and what to ignore, and monitoring our progress during mental tasks. And Dr. Park and her colleagues found that such executive functions tend to deteriorate a little as we get older. For example, as we age, many people have a somewhat harder time keeping their attention focused without getting distracted. Many others can't multitask quite as well as when they were younger. And perhaps the most important ability that depends on executive functions is what psychologists call working memory. Now, working memory refers to our ability to store information temporarily, maintain it over brief periods of time, and then retrieve it later on in the service of some mental computation. And it requires the ability to rehearse information that you want to remember, to update what you're trying to remember, and to retrieve information that you previously stored away. So in short, it requires the ability to exert executive control over your memory system. For example, suppose I ask you to add 27 and 36 in your head without writing them down. After storing the 2 numbers in your memory, you might begin by adding the 7 and the 6 in the ones column to get 13. Then you store away the 3 as an intermediate result in your working memory. Next, you might retrieve the 2 and the 3 that were in the tens column from your working memory. Then you add those together to get 5. Then you have to retrieve the fact that you carried a 1, so that gives you 6 as the result in the tens column. And finally, you have to retrieve that intermediate result of 3 that you stored away temporarily. And putting the 6 and the 3 together, you come up with the final answer of 63. But figuring that out required a number of executive control operations to store information away temporarily, to update what was in your working memory, and to retrieve that information later on. Well, Dr. Park's team asked their participants to perform a number of these kinds of working memory tasks. For example, in the reading span task, people had to remember words while they were reading. In the computation span task, they had to remember numbers while they were performing arithmetic. And in the line span task, they had to remember the spatial locations of lines while they connected dots. And when they looked at the performance as a function of age, they found a relatively constant linear decline in performance with each passing decade, just like we saw with processing speed. And like processing speed, the decline started in the 20s. That is, the 20-year-olds performed a little better than the 30-year-olds, the 30-year-olds performed a little better than the 40-year-olds, and so on, all the way up to the 80-year-olds. And this was true for all the working memory tasks that they tested. For each of them, there was a gradual and relatively constant decline, and it started in the 20s. Okay, so processing speed tends to decline, and executive functions like working memory also tend to get a little worse as we get older. But Dr. Park and her colleagues also identified one other type of memory that sometimes declines with age, namely episodic memory. So, what exactly is episodic memory? Well, as its name suggests, episodic memory is memory for specific episodes from your life. For example, your memory for what you did last night is an episodic memory. So is your memory of a conversation, or a social event, or a memorable trip that you took. Episodic memories are tied to a specific time and place, and they're remembered from a first-person perspective. For example, I have an episodic memory of the first time I visited the Great Courses to record a lecture audition, and that memory is tied to this specific place on a particular day. I also remember it from my own perspective, as if I'm replaying it, looking out from my own eyes. And unlike working memories, which are short-term, episodic memories can last for a long time and are therefore considered to be long-term. For example, you may still have episodic memories from your childhood, like a memorable event that happened in kindergarten, or meeting a famous person, going to an exciting sporting event. But episodic memories can also be from just a few minutes ago. For example, your memory for what you've heard so far in this lecture, that would be an episodic memory. It too is tied to a specific time and place, namely a few minutes ago, and your current location. And it's also remembered from your own perspective, not mine, and not anybody else's. So, what happens to episodic memory as we age? Well, Dr. Park's team gave all of their participants 4 different tests of episodic memory. 2 of them required remembering visuospatial information. For example, they were shown a bunch of different line drawings, like maybe a triangle with a line underneath it. And then, a few minutes later, they were asked to try to reproduce as many of the drawings as they could from memory. They also tested their episodic memory for verbal information. In one test, called the free recall task, participants were presented with a bunch of random words, one at a time for 5 seconds each. And afterwards, they were asked to try to recall as many of the words as they could in any order. In another cued recall test, they were presented with pairs of words. And later on, they were given one of the words and asked to remember the word that was paired with it. For example, they might see the word dog paired with the word dig initially. And then, if they were shown dog, they would need to remember dig. And the results for all of the episodic memory tests looked very similar to each other. And in fact, they looked almost identical to the working memory and processing speed results that we talked about before. Once again, the 20-year-olds were a little better than the 30-year-olds. The 30-year-olds were a little better than the 40-year-olds, and so on, with a gradual but relatively constant decline with each passing decade. So the take-home message is that many people exhibit subtle declines in episodic memory as they get older, just like we saw for processing speed and working memory. But episodic memory isn't the only kind of long-term memory. For example, you remember that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that birds have wings. And those memories are also long-term. But those are memories for facts rather than memories for personal episodes. And that kind of factual memory is referred to as semantic memory. And it's quite different than episodic memory. For example, semantic memories aren't tied to a specific time and place, and they're not remembered from a first-person perspective. I mean, you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, even if you don't remember exactly when and where you learned that fact. And it's also not remembered from a first-person perspective. It's just a disembodied piece of knowledge that you happen to know. Now, Dr. Park's team also tested this kind of knowledge, this semantic memory. And to do so, they used 3 different kinds of vocabulary tasks. In 2 of the tasks, participants were presented with a target word, along with a set of alternative words in a multiple choice format. They then had to choose the alternative word that was most similar in meaning to the target word. The 3rd task was similar, except that people had to choose the antonym, that is, the alternative word whose meaning was the opposite of the target word. And the results for these tasks were very different than what we saw for processing speed and working memory and episodic memory. In fact, the older groups actually tended to perform better than the younger groups. They knew more words, and they were significantly better at coming up with synonyms and antonyms than the younger group. And these findings kind of bear out what most people typically suspect. We know more information when we're old compared with when we're young, and that makes a lot of sense. And other types of memory are also preserved in normal aging. In particular, many types of unconscious, implicit memory don't seem to decline much at all. For example, people are typically faster and more accurate at processing information if they've processed that same information in the recent past. So imagine that you're reading something out loud and you encounter a long and relatively infrequent word. The first time you read it, you might stumble over it a little bit. But when you encounter it a second time, you'll be a little faster. And by the 3rd or 4th time you read it, you'll probably be pretty fluent at reading it. Your previous experience in processing that information makes you a little better at processing it the next time. That's what psychologists call priming. And it's a very general memory phenomenon that applies in a variety of different domains. And it turns out that healthy older people show exactly the same kinds of priming effects as younger people do. Another type of memory that's preserved in normal aging is your memory for skills and habits, what's sometimes called procedural memory. So knowing how to read, how to cook, how to speak a language, how to play an instrument, how to tie your shoes. These are all examples of procedural memory. You may not be able to explain exactly how you perform these skills, you just have an unconscious memory for how to do so. So muscle memory for motor skills like riding a bike or tying your shoe, those are good examples. But you also have procedural memories for cognitive skills like reading or speaking a language. And studies have repeatedly found that procedural memory doesn't normally decline as we get older. Although our strength and our coordination may get a little worse, the underlying memory for how to perform motor skills that we've acquired seems to remain intact as we age. Likewise, normal aging doesn't impair our memory for cognitive skills, like speaking a language or reading. The bottom line is that not everything declines with age. Many mental processes actually remain stable, and some even improve. And it's not just cognitive processes like semantic memory and procedural memory that are preserved. There's also substantial evidence that emotional life gets better for most people with age. For example, older people report greater life satisfaction and fewer negative emotions than young adults do. They're also better at resolving interpersonal problems and at sidestepping social conflict. We'll actually devote an entire lecture to the topic of how aging affects emotional processing later in the course. But what I want to emphasize right now is that a lot of our mental life is not adversely affected by age. In fact, age-related declines seem to be restricted to a few specific cognitive processes. Okay, before we finish our discussion of how aging affects cognition, I'd like to mention two general principles that these results support. First, they're consistent with the distinction between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence that was proposed by Dr. Raymond Cattell at the University of Illinois in the 1940s. Cattell showed that if you look at the performance of a large group of people across a wide range of tasks, you can typically identify two major factors that influence how well people do. The first is what he called fluid processing ability, or fluid intelligence. Now, fluid intelligence refers to cognitive processes that are relatively independent of what you know. So, can you think logically? Can you identify patterns? Can you solve novel problems quickly and effectively? Brain teasers and puzzles that depend more on your ability to think in creative ways than on how much you know, those would emphasize fluid processing ability. One good example would be the card game concentration or memory, in which cards are placed face down and players take turns trying to turn over pairs of matching cards. That doesn't really depend on how much you know, it just tests how much you can remember. So that would be a good test of fluid processing. The other factor is what Cattell called crystallized intelligence. Now, crystallized intelligence refers to cognitive abilities that depend critically on knowledge, experience, and acquired skills. For example, crossword puzzles would place significant demands on crystallized intelligence because they depend a lot on how much you know about the world. Okay, well, Cattell showed that older people tend to do a little worse on fluid processing tasks than younger people do. But he also showed that they tend to do better on tasks that rely on crystallized knowledge. For example, young people might tend to beat older people at concentration, but might not be as good at crossword puzzles. And that's exactly what Dr. Park and her colleagues found. The tasks of working memory, of episodic memory, and processing speed, those were all fluid processing tasks. They required being able to process or remember novel information quickly and effectively. But they didn't depend on knowing a lot of factual information beforehand. And sure enough, performance on all these tasks declined with age. In contrast, the knowledge-based tasks that tested semantic memory and verbal knowledge, those were tests of crystallized intelligence. And performance on those kinds of tasks didn't decline with age. In fact, it actually improved. The second general point to make is that declines in processing speed may actually underlie age-related declines in other fluid processing tasks, including tests of working memory and episodic memory. So think about it. If your mental processing gets a little bit slower, then you wouldn't be able to rehearse as much information in a given amount of time. So it makes sense that measures of working memory and episodic memory might not be quite as good. Likewise, problem solving and other fluid processing abilities might suffer. For example, suppose it took you a full 5 seconds to remember individual arithmetic facts like 4 plus 3 equals 7 and 6 minus 1 equals 5. Now, don't you think that would make it much harder to add and subtract multi-digit numbers? You'd constantly lose track of where you were in the problem, and you'd likely need to start over a few times. Well, consistent with these intuitions, there's now quite a bit of evidence that declines in processing speed may underlie a lot of the subtle cognitive declines associated with aging. For example, in 1996, Dr. Timothy Salthouse, who was at Georgia Tech at the time, wrote a famous paper in which he analyzed the relationship between processing speed and age-related declines in fluid intelligence. For example, he made graphs in which the y-axis was performance on a fluid processing task, and the x-axis was age. And each person in his study was a single dot on the graph, representing their age and fluid processing performance. And if you look at these kinds of scatter plots, you can see a clear trend in which older people tend to do worse. However, he then replotted the data after removing the effects of processing speed on fluid intelligence. And after controlling for processing speed, age had almost no effect on fluid intelligence. Likewise, Dr. Park's team also found that processing speed was a key predictor of how well people did on their fluid intelligence tasks, specifically their working memory and episodic memory tasks. I also want to mention one very important limitation of the studies that we've discussed so far. These studies did not follow the same people over the course of their lifetime. Rather, they recruited a group of people who were in their 20s, another group in their 30s, another group in their 40s, and so on. And then they measured the performance of all these groups at a single moment in time. Now, that's what's called a cross-sectional design, because it recruits a cross-section of the population and studies them all at once. And doing that is convenient and it's efficient, but it does have a major drawback. You see, the groups of people in each decade of life probably differ in systematic ways that aren't directly related to their chronological age. Their diets may be different. The quality of health care that they've received is probably different. Even the amount of stress that they've experienced could be quite different. I mean, for example, consider generations that experienced the Great Depression or were involved in a major war versus generations that didn't have those experiences. And these kinds of differences in diet, in health care, and stress could all very plausibly influence cognitive abilities. So we need to keep in mind the possibility that what look like age-related changes could actually be related to some factor other than age. The better approach is to use what's called a longitudinal design, in which you follow the same people over time. Now, of course, that takes a long time, and it's much more demanding. But there have been a few studies that have managed to follow the same people for a few decades. And fortunately for scientists studying aging, many of the conclusions from cross-sectional studies have held up. In particular, processing speed, working memory, and episodic memory definitely do decline with age. However, exactly when that decline starts is a little more controversial. In particular, whereas cross-sectional studies have suggested a linear decline starting in the 20s, some longitudinal studies suggest that the decline may not start until after age 50. Another important lesson from longitudinal studies is that there are substantial individual differences in how aging affects cognition. Some people decline a lot as they age. Some people decline a little, and some people don't seem to decline much at all. Of course, when you average across such a heterogeneous group, what you observe is a modest level of overall decline with age. The truth is that there's substantial variability, and in particular, experiencing cognitive impairments is not an inevitable consequence of aging. In fact, in the last few lectures of this course, we'll spend a lot of time talking about specific strategies that have been scientifically demonstrated to help people age more gracefully. Okay, let's finish up. In this lecture, we've seen that our brains do age, but in very specific ways. Processing speed, episodic memory, and executive functions like working memory tend to get a little worse as we get older. But many other cognitive processes remain stable or even improve with age. Furthermore, not everyone experiences these declines to the same degree. Why is that? I mean, what is going on at a more fundamental, nuts and bolts level? Specifically, what are the actual biological mechanisms that cause the brain to change as we age? Well, to answer that question, we need to explore how aging affects us at a cellular and even molecular level. Do our cells themselves get old? And if so, why? Is aging genetically programmed into our DNA? And given that aging is associated with disease and ultimately with mortality, why hasn't natural selection already gotten rid of it? Those are the questions that we'll tackle in our next lecture.